Hey guys, so today we're going to be doing an LS430, which is a 3UZ VVT-i. This one is actually a bit of a mix and match, so we'll explain more in a minute. So let's get into it. Right, so as discussed, this is an LS430 3UZ, but as I said, it's a bit of a mix and match with this one. The customer, Gino, has ended up with a 3UZ 6-speed LS430 engine, so 03 to 05, but he's ended up with a 5-speed ECU. So what we have done is we've made him an entire new harness. So we're going to have some 6-speed items and some 5-speed items incorporated into this harness. All right, so as it is a completely brand new harness, what we're going to do first of all is obviously cut to the pictures of the whole build process so you guys can see exactly what that is. So let's do that now. We're back in a second.
Never break, always fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, feel the pain, live the grind, I could change, in my mind, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life. I never miss that stack, taking big swings, put your hand to the bat, put me in the ring, you'll go out in a bag, cause I sing what I mean and I bring it to the mad light. Ain't got time to kill, I got time to feel, I took the red pill, I know life's short so I wanna live real, but how's it supposed to feel? How's it supposed to feel? How's it supposed to feel?
Right, so now you've seen exactly what it looks like underneath and the whole build process, and it's obviously some of the sub harnesses that we do for these now. What we're going to do today is we're going to go in the layout, so we're going to go through the entire harness so the customer Gino knows where everything connects. Then what we're going to do is pop back and go through all of the connections that he needs to make on his side to the fuse box. Once we've done that, then we're going to actually run into the testing, and as per usual, the testing is made up of two sections, one with just the ignition on and one with the engine actually running. So without further ado, let's grab in and get into the layout. So we're going to start here at the ECU as we normally do. So you do have your three connectors there, 1, 2, 3. So that is for the engine harness itself, so that's nice and simple. You then have your two body plugs over there, and they obviously relate to the body side stuff, so they go straight to the fuse box. But you also have the pedal harness on here, so we do make it on a sub harness. So again, it is all nicely labeled for you guys, so you can see there it does say pedal or PDL. Right, so that's that. So as I said, that goes straight to the fuse box. Coming out of the harness here as well is the powers for the actual engine harness itself. So they come out there and they plug directly into the fuse box. Now, with these fuse boxes, every single plug is unique, so you can't actually plug in the wrong plug into the wrong place, so you don't have to stress about that. Same with the ECU, all 5 of these plugs are unique, so you cannot plug the one into the wrong slot, so you don't have to stress about that either. Right, so moving further along there, we're going to end up at our grommet that we've got fitted on here, and as per usual, we haven't shrunk down the heat shrink on the outside of the grommet, so the customer can feel free to move this grommet anywhere where it's going to be applicable for his particular installation. Moving along there, we're going to end up at our molded boot over here. So that's a T-piece boot, so the harness can split off and go around to the front, around the back, and then around the other side over there. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll start from here, we'll go all the way down there, then we'll come back and we'll make our way around there. So what's coming out here? Obviously you have the harness section that breaks out and goes down over there, but we do have our modular ignition harnesses on these engines now. We've done them so that basically if you guys ever wanted to upgrade to a standalone ECU, so you do have the ability to swap out the coils as well as the injectors as per usual. Okay, so that comes on a little 8-pin DTM plug there, and that's going to go to your 4 coils. Again, everything is labeled, so you can see that's IGN7, it's IGN5, IGN3, and IGN1. So remember, it's cylinder 1, 3, 5, and 7 on there. Right, moving further along, well, you can see underneath over here, it's then going to break out over here by the cam sensor. So this is the cam sensor for the left bank. So remember, the VVT-i engines have 3 cam sensors on the standard ECU. So you're measuring both inlet cams, and this is in relation to the movement, because obviously they're VVT-i, so the cams can obviously advance and retard. So that's measuring the movement of the cams to make sure that whatever the ECU is commanding via the oil control valve is being achieved. You then also have the cam sensor at the front here. Now this is obviously a fixed point, so it's going to tell the ECU exactly what position the pistons are in relation to each other. Okay, so that's used for the fully sequential fuel and ignition, and then obviously these ones are just used to measure the particular degrees of the cams that's being advanced or retarded. Right, so moving along there, we just tuck the harness nice and neatly here, and it's going to break out sort of here close to injector 1. That's going to go to the oil control valve, which we briefly touched on there, and that's the oil control valve for the VVT-i for this bank over here. Also breaking out over there is going to be the cam sensor, and again you can see there's a nice mounting point here that you should have, that you can then just clip this harness down here and keep it out of the way. Moving down over here, we then have the holes there and there, which you should have some plastic clips to obviously keep the harness out of the way of any particular thing. Obviously you can see we've removed the aircon here, so we're just running the belt around the pulley and so on, completely out of the way. But yeah, so you can keep that nice and neat out of the way there. Once you get around the corner here, it's going to split into 3 sections, okay? 2 of the sections go straight down the hole over here, straight down into there, and you'll see there is the crank sensor. Again, everything is labeled for you guys. And we've also got the oil pressure switch. All right, so in this particular case, the engine that the customer will have should have this exact oil filter housing, so that goes there. What we have done is, in case you guys need to fit the oil filter housing that goes towards the back, we've obviously split the oil up at the top here, so it can run down to there. That is if that is required. The last section that breaks out, and it can actually go through here as well. So again, if you're not running an aircon pump, you can just run the plug through here, down through here, along to here, and that is going to be for your lambda sensor. Now, obviously you are aware that on the standard 3UZ harness that comes from Toyota, they bring the lambda sensor plug down there. We've moved it underneath here so that it can stay away from the exhaust heat, and obviously it just means things like the connectors and so on last a lot longer, rather than being effectively right next to the exhaust between the block over there. Okay, right, so that's that section over there. What we're going to do is go to the back over here, and then we're going to move that way and then work our way around there. Okay, obviously the pedal's mounted to the inlet manifold. That's just the one that runs to the plug over there, just in case I don't want to get that in the way there. Right, so coming out of the boot over here, we have 3 sections. So first is going to be your ground. Okay, now on the back of a 3UZ cylinder head, this is the bolt that you should have. Notice you do have 2 other holes there that will take an M8 bolt, okay? On your standard engine, those will obviously have nothing in them. So it's an M6 hole that you're going to use to ground the harness, and this is the only ground on the harness. Okay, so there's no other grounds, just this one over here. All right, next up is going to be what I call the sub harness, because it goes underneath, okay? And that goes to your starter and your knock sensor. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to cut to a picture of what it looks like underneath there. You can see that everything is labeled like knock 1, knock 2, and starter solenoid. Okay. Right, so following on from there, we then have our injector harness. Okay. So that's that's the sub harness for the injectors. Okay. You go through there. I do have a video on how to install that, so you guys know exactly what to do. But it goes along here. It plugs into the acoustic control induction system vacuum solenoid valve, and then all of your injectors pop out over here and just go into your individual injectors over there. Okay, so again, we've done that for 2 reasons. Number 1, if you guys go with an aftermarket ECU later and we make you a patch harness, you can obviously change the injectors to whatever you want. But secondly, it means you can remove the entire intake to do the starter motor or whatever you want to do, and you don't have to actually unplug all the injectors. And that's what killed these connectors, just the constant connect, disconnect, disconnect. All right, so if you can not disconnect those and pull the whole inlet manifold off, that's fantastic. So you can do that by just disconnecting at the back here, and you can lift the whole inlet manifold off. We've done the same with the throttle as well. So the throttle is on a sub harness. So you'll see you can actually remove this entire intake with throttle without having to remove a single connection, apart from the 1 injector harness at the back and the 1 throttle harness on the side there. Okay. Right, so that's all the sections that break out there, and then you can see I'm just temporarily using a P-clamp to hold it down there, but I'm going to flick around the other side, and then we're going to carry on with the rest of it. I do apologize in advance. I've come down with a cold, so my voice is going to sound incredibly weird. Anyway, so coming down over here, you've got another mounting point that you can put a P-clamp on over there if you so wish. All right. Then we break out at this particular position, and that's going to go to our second ignition harness. Okay, so that is now for the right bank. So you'll see here again, this is all labeled ignition 2, ignition 4, ignition 6, and ignition 8. Okay, just going to tuck that out the way there. Right, then the harness carries on all the way along to there, and it's going to break out over here to go to the cam sensor for the right bank. Okay, so this is the 3rd cam sensor that I was speaking about. Then the harness is going to move along to over there, and it's going to break out at the front. It's going to be quite a few sections coming out here. First of all, we've got our throttle section. So as I said, the throttle is on a sub harness, so it means you guys can change the throttle around. So again, this is going to fall more in line of if you guys either can't get hold of your particular throttle, or if you're going with an aftermarket ECU and you want to change to like a Bosch throttle body. It just means that instead of having to replace the whole harness, you can just unplug this throttle section and we could make a sub harness for a Bosch throttle, or basically whatever throttle you wanted. Next up is going to be our coolant temp sensor. So that's this 2-pin black plug over there. So that just bolts directly in there. What we've also done is we've added a temp wire. So this is for you guys that want to run just sort of analog gauges for coolant temperature. If you're not taking the data via OBD2 or whatever from the ECU and you want to fit your own separate gauge, this is the wire that you can use. And obviously it's just left you with a long piece there, so you can put whatever terminal or whatever is required for your particular setup. Next up, we have the oil control valve for the right bank. So that plugs in directly over there. So that's really nice and straightforward. And then lastly, in terms of the breakouts to particular sensors, we have the mass airflow sensor. Okay, so that comes out over there. So bearing in mind, pretty much all the 3UZs, or as far as I'm aware, all the 3UZs have this style of MAF sensor. Some have an angled plug up, some goes down. But again, I would always refer you to Toyota DIY. Put in your particular model, and like I said, the best thing to do is to match the sensors to the ECU. So take your ECU part number, stick it in Toyota DIY, find whatever sensors are required for that one. That means you can't really go wrong and you'll always have the right sensors for that. Right, so that is the mass airflow sensor. Then the harness is going to carry on down over here, and it's going to break out at the bottom over here, and you're going to see here we've got our alternator sub harness. All right, now more importantly, as I said, if you take a look at the throttle, which has the 6-pin plug instead of the 4-pin and the 2-pin plug like a normal 5-speed one, obviously that is going to work just fine, even though we're using a 5-speed ECU that we've done many times, and it's absolutely no problem at all. But the second problem is he's going to have a 4-pin plug ECU, so I'm sorry, alternator. So his alternator plug is going to look like this. So this is his actual sub harness for the alternator. So what I've got here is a temporary measure, which is our 3-pin oval style alternator connector. So you can see that over there. All right, and the last section is going to be the lambda sensor for this particular side over here. Okay, so remember on the 3UZs you have a long plug on the right bank lambda sensor, and you have a short plug on the left bank lambda sensor. Now these are not the same. So you can't use this one on the other side and vice versa. If you do, you get a code. So the wiring is different for these two particular sensors. So do bear that in mind when you are trying to order it. Make sure that you get the two correct ones. Now, obviously, we're only using these sensors. We're not using the secondary ones after the catalytic converter. Luckily, the remap that's been done on the ECU that we do for everyone, it's removed all of the secondary lambda sensors. So we're not going to get any codes or errors or anything for those ones, which we'll go through when we do the testing. You'll see when we go through the codes, we've got absolutely no codes in relation to the ECU, either for the automatic transmission or the secondary lambdas or anything like that. Okay, so yeah, so as I said, you can see clearly he's got a 6-speed throttle. You can see there we've got where the TPS would normally be as blank, 6-pin throttle over there, and then obviously his alternator would have the 4-pin connector, not the 3-pin connector. And this is another reason why we put the alternator on a sub harness, is if you guys with the 5-speed models wanted to upgrade to the newer 6-speed ones, it's very easy to do. You just have to be incredibly careful, because the crown alternator that has the 4-pin plug is the one that I've come across that's actually controlled via the ECU. So unfortunately, you can't use that one unless you have a crown ECU. But luckily, the LS430 and the GS430 6-speed ECUs, they alternators use the 4-pin plug, but they only use 3 out of the 4 wires. They have exactly the same wiring as the oval connectors. Okay, so you can always swap out for those ones. You just can't with the crown. All right, and obviously the SC430 actually carried the oval style plug all the way to 2010, so makes no odds or sods there. All right. Okay, so that is the entire layout of the harness. So hopefully customer Gino is going to have a really quick time to get this all on. Hopefully, obviously, you guys find the sub harness is nice and useful. Again, like this with the coils over here. So one thing I didn't mention is, again, you can actually just unbolt and remove all of these coils without having to take these plugs off. And again, it's the same story as the injectors. These plugs are quite difficult to get off, number one. Number two, the more you take them off and put them on, the shorten their lifespan. So if you can just unplug this DTM plug, pull all the coils out, change the spark plugs, put it all back in again, that is fantastic, and obviously applies to both sides. Right, so that is the complete layout. As I said, what we're going to do now is we're going to jump over to the actual wires that the customer needs to connect on his side. So with all of our harnesses, you do get this welcome pack. Obviously, there's more pages than this. There's pages in relation to the fuse box to tell you what each fuse is and what the rating should be, what each relay is, and how, and obviously what you need to replace it with if you need to. Right, so starting with the 9-pin plug, which is again our standardized plug. So we have kept that nice and standard. So you'll see the same plug pretty much across the whole range. Now it covers most of the basic stuff. So again, that's going to be really straightforward. And then we've got the 6-pin plug because we need to include an OBD2 connector, which you can clearly see over there. That's how you're going to read all your live data from your ECU. So starting with the 9-pin plug, nice and simple. Pin number 1, red 14 gauge wire, permanent 12 volts. Now I can't stress enough, I do mean permanent 12 volts. The reason is the ECU doesn't hold memory. It requires a permanent 12 volts in order to store any data. What data? Things like trouble codes, things like long-term fuel trims, etc., etc. If you connect that to an ignition source, that means every time you turn the key off, the ECU is going to completely reset, and it's going to do two things. Number one, it's not going to be able to do long-term fuel trims correctly. Number two, if you're trying to do diagnostics and every single time you turn the key off, you wipe the ECU so there's no stored codes, you're going to have a nightmare when you're trying to diagnose it. You just have to trust me on that one, because normally when I do diagnostics, our first thing I'll do is I'll read the codes, I'll actually write them all down, and then what I'll do is I'll unplug the ECU to completely, wipe it and reset it, and then basically start the car up again a couple of times, try and recreate the problem and see what codes come back. Because sometimes the ECU will store a code that only ran for like 5 seconds, but it's always helpful to know that there's something that might be affecting your problem that you are having. Okay, so that's number one, permanent 12 volts. Again, please, permanent 12 volts, not ignition. Next up is going to be the black with the yellow tracer. Now that is a start signal. So basically what I mean is the starter from your key. All right, that requires 12 volts. So if you're taking it from your key barrel, it's nice and easy to find. You just move the key to the start position and that'll obviously go from there. If you're going to use a switch, like a push button switch for your start, obviously the other side of the switch goes to ignition 12 volts. The other side goes to our black with the yellow tracer wire. Next up is going to be yellow with a green. So that's this bad boy down here. Now that is the temp one. And what I mean by that is that's this section over here, the one I went through earlier. Okay. All right. And then the next up is gray. And that is a 16 gauge wire. All right. And that is for your fuel pump. Now, in this case, the fuel pump is controlled via the ECU. I do have a video, which I'll put a link up to now, to explain to you how the Lexus fuel pump systems work, just so that you guys are aware of that. I would advise you watch it, especially Gino, just to make sure you're happy with everything, because weird things like it doesn't prime. So we get so many calls saying, I turn everything on, it doesn't prime. That's perfectly normal. That's not how the Toyota and Lexus systems work. Okay, so no prime, only runs in certain conditions. Please watch the video. It goes into great detail and explains everything to you guys. Next up is going to be yellow with a red. So that is over there. That is our check engine light. Now there are two of them. I did put one inside the fuse box as well, just in case you guys don't connect that up. You can still lay this out exactly like I've done on a table here with an engine on a stand, and you can start the whole thing up. But that's why I give you the check engine light there, so you can see that everything is coming alive and turning on as it should do. Next up is going to be yellow. And again, that one is down there. Okay, and that is going to be the tacho signal. So what I've done is both for the check engine light and the tacho, I've actually connected it to my IS200 cluster over here. Same with the coolant temp. This device is just translating multiplex communication from analog signals over to the dash so that I can see the temperature gauges working, and then we're going to go through the other ones like alternator light, oil light, etc. Okay, but the check engine light and the tacho go straight to the cluster and they're going to feed it there directly. All right. After the yellow comes the black with the red. So black with a red tracer. That is your ignition 12 volts. That's to turn the whole system on. So do bear in mind that if you are using a key to find ignition, most key barrels have accessory ignition start and off, obviously. Now, the problem is accessory provides 12 volts, but it cuts it as soon as you move the key to the start position. So if you are looking for an ignition 12 volt source from a key barrel, what you do need to do, find the 12 volts behind the key barrel, move the key to the start position and make sure that 12 volts doesn't disappear. It happens more than you think. Guys will grab a multimeter, find 12 volts, go, that's great. And then every time they go to crank the car, you're effectively shutting the ECU down so it doesn't start. And then you guys are scratching your head for ages, because obviously the second you turn the key back, you've got 12 volts, everything is working. The check engine light is on, it's fantastic. Go to turn the key on, you can't see that because it's in the footwell. bosh, and then you say, why is it not starting? Well, that's the reason why. So nice and simple. Key, find 12 volts, move the key to the start position. If the 12 volts goes away, you've got accessory not suitable for that wire. If you find a 12 volts and you move the key to the start position, 12 volts stays, that's the one you want to connect to that one over there. If you're using a switch on your dash because you've gutted everything out, then it's no odds or sods. Other side of it to battery 12 volts, other side to our black with a red wire, away you go. Next up is going to be the pink with the blue. So that's this one down here. All right, that is your alternator light. So again, at the moment, I've got it hooked up to this because it's going to translate the multiplex communication. So we can see the alternator on the dash, so I can see that it's working. Now, a little hints and tips for you guys. They are giving out an earth. Okay, now I have come across issues on older model vehicles, and that's usually where they have the incandescent bulbs for the cluster. I have actually seen where they're back feeding through the alternator light into the alternator, and obviously the alternator has both an ignition and a permanent 12 volts connection there as well, and so it's back feeding in, and I've seen cases of where it's actually kept the harness alive, so it's back feeding all the way in to there. Second of all, I've seen them keep the regulators on, so like literally within 3 months, boom, alternator's gone, and you can't figure out why. And if you're going through alternators like every 3 to 6 months, just check that, because that might be the reason that you are suffering from that. Okay, so remember, it's a ground. If you're using an old dash that has an incandescent bulb on, you can do one of two things. Number one, you can swap the bulb for an LED. That's by far the easiest solution. Most dashes have LED equivalents. Boom, you're done, because an LED is a diode. If you can't get an LED, the next option is to fit a diode. That would then stop any possibility of backfeeding into the system. Okay, or if you scrapped everything and you're setting up your own little dash, just go buy those little LED lights for oil and charge light, and then that way your problem is resolved. There's no backfeeding because the LEDs in there, all sorted out. Which brings me on to the next one, which is the yellow with the black, which is right next to that one over there, and that is your oil pressure switch. So that one is connected to this one down here. All right, and again, it's just a simple ground. It doesn't have anything to do with the ECU. Same with the alternator light. They just come straight from the harness, straight to those wires over there. So you don't have to worry about ECU issues or anything with that, just for indication only. Okay. Right, so moving on to the 6-pin plug. 4 of the wires are not really much use to you because they only relate to the OBD2 connector. You'll see I've labeled them 1 to 4, just said OBD2 connector. Nothing for you to do there. It's a complete plug all the way to there, and that's so you can read all of your live data via an OBD2 machine, which we'll also be doing as part of the testing. Number 5 is going to be your white with a blue tracer, and that is your brake switch. Okay, so for the Toyota systems, they do have a brake system whereby they know both when the brake pedal is not depressed and when it is depressed. So we've taken care of that via a relay inside the fuse box, so you don't need to worry about that at all. All we need you guys to do is basically connect the 12 volt supply that would normally go to your brake lights, and you can connect it directly to this wire over here. Now, that is not having any direct connection to the ECU. It's only triggering a relay, and the relay is then fused via a 5 amp fuse. So there's absolutely no way of any issues in relation to the ECU in terms of the brake signaling. But again, nice and simple for you guys. All you got to do basically is connect the white with the blue tracer to a 12 volt source that activates when you press the brake. So obviously your brake lights is the easiest one, because that's exactly where it'll be working from. The reason I mention that is because sometimes you might find that your brake switch on your pedal is a ground switch. That might just be grounding a relay, which then turns on the brake lights. Okay, so just bear that in mind, that don't always assume that the wire that's coming from your brake pedal switch is going to be 12 volts. Okay, most of them, some of them are, some of them aren't, so you do need to check that as well. Right, so those are all the wires that the customer would need to connect in this particular case. Obviously, you don't need to connect all of them. If you wanted to start this thing on the floor or whatever before you put it all in, not a problem at all. You literally just connect permanent 12 volts, the red one. Fuel pump, obviously you need a fuel pump of some sorts to get it running. You need the black with the red tracer, and obviously you're going to need your start signal from that. So you're going to see how easy I'm going to basically do it, and all I've really got connected is, there's my red permanent 12 volts, there's my fuel pump, and I've got those 2 wires ready to connect up. Right, okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get it all set up for actually testing with just the ignition on, and then we'll move into the actual engine running. So let me get everything prepped. Be with you guys in a second. All right, so now we're going to move into the testing phase. And as I said, there are two sections to this. So one is just with the ignition on. We'll do a couple of tests there, and then we'll actually get the engine up and running, and we'll carry out some tests there as well. First thing I'm going to do is run through all the tests that we are going to do. Then we'll jump in straight to the ignition test. To do the warm engine running test, one of them is obviously the coolant temp. So I'm going to go away, let the engine warm up, come back again so we can see that information on the dash. Right, so in terms of what we're going to test with the ignition on, that's going to be the check engine light. So I'm looking for the LED in the fuse box to light up. I'm also looking for the check engine light on the dash there, right? That tells me that my yellow with the red tracer wire is correct. Next up, we're going to look at the oil pressure light. So again, our oil pressure light is connected to our device, which is translating that data via multiplex, and it'll make the oil red light appear on the dash over there. What I will then do is unplug the oil pressure switch, come back to the dash, and you'll see that light will turn off. That obviously indicates to me that it is all correct and working as it should do. Then next up is the alternator light. That's going to be the exact same process. Once you switch the ignition on, the alternator light will come on. I'm going to quickly go unplug the alternator, come back again, and you'll see that light has gone off. Next up is going to be the OBD2 machine. So what I mean is I'm basically going to make sure this is communicating. It is plugged into the plug which goes into the fuse box. So I'm making sure that obviously when the harness gets to the customer that they can do exactly what I've done here and plug in an OBD2 diagnostic machine to read it. Next up, we're going to test the fuel pump. So basically all I'm going to effectively do is literally just activate the fuel pump via the OBD2 machine. Because remember, with this ECU, the fuel pump is controlled via the ECU. And then what we're going to look for is obviously the clicking of the relay to indicate that the fuel pump is working as it should do. All right. Then what we're going to do is we move over to the actual engine running. A couple of more tests there. So we're going to do starter circuits. So what I mean by that, I just want to make sure that when I touch the black with the yellow tracer wire on 12 volts, that the engine turns over and fires up. So I know the whole starter circuit is working as we expect it to. Then we're going to come over to the ACIS, or acoustic control induction system. What I'm basically looking for is this valve to go closed, which it should do a few seconds after startup. And what I have done is I've got a really good video explaining exactly how the system works. I've got pictures of what it looks like underneath with the actual manifold split into two sections, etc. So you guys can see exactly what's going on here, how it works, and most importantly, why it's super important. Okay, so I do advise to watch that. It's very informative. Next up is going to be the tach signal. So we're going to come back to the cluster once it's started, and all we're looking for is a signal coming through there. Now in this case, I'm just wiring the tachometer directly to the cluster, so it's a 4-cylinder signal being given out to a 6-cylinder cluster, so I expect it to be a little bit lower than what you would actually see on my diagnostic machine. Next up is going to be the coolant temp. So as I said, I'm going to let the engine warm up before we come back to the running test. So we should be seeing immediately when I come back that the coolant temp gauge has actually risen off its low value. Next up is going to be drive-by-wire. So what I'm going to be doing now is just literally pressing the pedal and testing it out. Okay, so again, these are full drive-by-wire with the 3UZs. There's absolutely no accelerator cables involved whatsoever. But we have obviously wired in the customer's pedal with the throttle, and as soon as I touch that pedal, the engine should rev up. All right. Next up is going to be VVT-i solenoids. So what I mean by that is obviously these oil control valves, which is what controls the VVT-i on the inlet cams. I can, with my machine, basically retard and advance the cams so it sounds like a really lumpy cam engine, but that will then indicate to me that everything is working as I expect it to. Obviously, if I do the test and it just stays idling normally, then we know that there's a problem with the oil control valve system. After that, it's going to be injectors and coils. Now, obviously, I can only remove the injectors one by one, which is effectively what I'm going to be doing. Now, I'm going to go literally cylinder by cylinder and do that. The reason I remove the injectors and not the coils is because with the 3UZ system, what it does is if it picks up through the ignition feedback that a coil is misfiring, it shuts off the injectors. So unfortunately, if I had to unplug each coil one by one, I would literally slowly and surely be killing the engine as we went down to 1 or 2 cylinders. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pop back into the OBD2 machine. We're going to check the codes that we do not have. So obviously, as you're aware, this is a manual harness. You can see there's absolutely no gearbox wiring whatsoever. This is a 3UZ, which all came as autos. So technically speaking, I should see no codes, and that is going to indicate to me that the remap that's been done on the ECU is correct and working exactly as we expect it to. Right, so that's basically all the tests we're going to carry out. So first thing I'm going to do is let's jump into the ignition on tests, and that's going to be starting with supplying the power. So as I said below, or said before, your black with the red wire, that's your ignition, 12 volts. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to give that 12 volts, and you're going to see the system come alive. So I'll just put it over to the dash over there. Okay, so you can hear the relays clicking on there. So the first one was the check engine light. So I've got the LED on the fuse box, so that's gravy. I've got the check engine light on the dash, so that's all good. Oil pressure light, you can clearly see down at the bottom there, I've got my red oil pressure light and I've got my alternator light. So next step is, I'm going to quickly disconnect the oil pressure switch. And as I come back, you can clearly see there, oil pressure light has gone out. So super happy with that. No, that's all correct. Then let's go back. You can see that comes straight back on again. Let's go disconnect the alternator. So nice and easy because we've got our sub harness on here. I'll just disconnect that. You will see straight away that the alternator light has gone out. And plug it back in again. Let's go in there. Fantastic. Right, and our charge light is back on again over there, so super happy with that. Right, so the OBD2 machine, I've already fired it up because it takes about literally half an age because these machines are really slow. But you can see here it has actually picked up that it is an LS430. Again, it is connected to the OBD2 plug, which is attached to our fuse box. I'm obviously interested in the engine side, so I'm just going to go over to the data list now. And so what we're going to hopefully be seeing is a bunch of live data. So that's going to be things like intake air temp, coolant temp, etc., etc. That's going to indicate to me that obviously it is communicating, and that makes me super happy. So if I go down here and I just wait, there you go. So you can see we've got coolant temp 18 degrees, intake air 21 degrees, which is exactly what I expect to be a few degrees of each other. Obviously the engine hasn't been running before the video. Right, so as I said, next thing we're going to do is the fuel pump test. So what I'm going to actually do is, in this case, I'm going to plug in the fuel pump so you can actually hear the fuel pump running. That obviously tells me as well that all the wiring on the customer plug is correct. So again, you see I've got fuel pump, relay and fuel pump. If you watch that video about the fuel pump system, you'll understand exactly why that is. So if you haven't, you can go back and watch that one. Right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flick this arrow and it's going to turn the fuel pump on. So 3, 2, 1. You can hear the relay click. I'm going to turn it off. There you go. So super happy. That means the ECU is controlling the fuel pump exactly as I expected it to, and we're going to be super happy with that. Right, so those are all the tests we're going to do with the ignition on. So as I said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go off. I'm going to let the engine warm up so that we can see the coolant temp on the dash. I'm going to pop back and I'll see you guys in a second. Bye-bye. Right, so now we're ready for the actual engine running test. So as I said, obviously I wanted to get it warmed up so we can see some coolant temperature on the dash. It's about 60 degrees now, so I'm all good with that. We have some reading through on the dash there. Right, so just a quick recap. I know it's not that long ago, but we're going to test the starter circuit, make sure that's working so the engine fires up. We're going to test the ACIS, or acoustic control induction system, so make sure that that valve closes. We're going to test the tach, so basically just go look over there, make sure we're getting a tach signal through there. Coolant temp, we'll take a look on the dash there, make sure that that is showing coolant temp. Drive-by-wire, I'm literally just going to rev it. Well, you can actually hear the throttle already working. VVT-i solenoids, I'm just going to go back to the machine and we're going to test those out. Then I'm going to go around and unplug each injector one by one so you can actually hear the engine misfiring as I do that, so you can make sure that every single cylinder is firing as it should do. Then we're going to pop back and we're going to check those codes out, or the lack thereof basically. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to get my ear defenders on. And as per the wiring instructions, all I'm going to basically do is touch the black with the yellow tracer wire with 12 volts and she'll start up. Right, so you can see our check engine light goes off immediately. Same as that, same with the oil pressure and the alternator as well. So we're super happy with that. Right, so now we're going to move over to the ACIS. And you can see that valve has gone down. Super happy with that. Looking over at the tach, you can see we've got a tach signal coming through there. Super happy with that. Coolant temp, as you can see we've got coolant temp showing on the dash, super happy with that. Okay. All right, so that is that. Right, so I've done all the tests that I want to do. Super happy with everything over there. Obviously, I did rev the engine, but you can see how happy she is. Part of the remap is obviously making the throttle super responsive, so that's completely normal. Obviously, I don't have a gearbox or anything on for any sort of mass for the engine to turn over either. All right, so again, super happy with all the tests. Everything is going exactly as I expected to. So the next step is, let's get this harness off to the customer, and he can get his vehicle running after all the trouble he's had, obviously, with having the mismatch of all the other stuff as well. Right, guys, but thanks for watching. Hope this has been helpful. Again, if you guys are ending up in the same situation, I have actually seen it a lot in America, where the guys are selling engines, and because the ECUs technically look exactly the same, I do actually have a video to show you guys what the differences are between the 5-speed and the 6-speed ECUs, especially on the American and European markets, so you guys can spot the differences. But it's very common for engine sellers to just grab whatever ECU looks like it fits and chuck it on. So if you are buying an engine on its own, I would advise that you can basically either watch that video where I describe all the different 3UZs, specifically again for the European and American market, not so much for the Japanese market. But if you guys are doing it, I have seen it quite a few times. Make sure you have the correct ECU for the correct engine and have a look out for those bits and bobs. But even if you do end up in that situation, as I've demonstrated here, everything is fixable, and we can still use the 6-speed throttle. You just need to change the knock sensors underneath, and literally that is it. We can obviously make an entire harness in either right-hand drive or left-hand drive, and you can use the 6-speed throttle or the 5-speed throttle. Again, that's why we like to do the sub harnesses. So even if this customer had a throttle problem and he could only get his hands on a 5-speed throttle, it's not an issue. You can phone us up. We can make him a little sub harness for the 5-speed throttle, and he can stick that on as well. Okay, and vice versa. Obviously, with the sub harness at the back, we do actually have the twin core shielded cable, so we could actually wire in the 6-speed 3UZ knock sensors if he ended up with a 3UZ 6-speed ECU. So again, if you have a 5-speed and then you end up with a 6-speed ECU, perfectly able to make it work. If you end up with a 6-speed engine with a 5-speed ECU, perfectly capable of making it work. There's nothing really that we can't fix. And obviously we can help you guys with whatever is required, whether it be knock sensors and where to get them, what the part numbers are, etc., etc. But again, thanks for watching, guys. If you do have any questions on anything you've seen today, you can comment down below. You can also message us on our Facebook page. We'll try and get back to you as soon as we possibly can. But again, thanks for watching, guys, and we will see you again soon. Bye-bye.